Yet another Nobel Prize winner has been caught with some dodgy looking stuff in his papers. The person I'm talking about is called Thomas Südhof, a German-American neuroscientist at Stanford. Now we'll get to the suspect looking stuff in his papers in a second, but first I want to give you a bit of background to Südhof himself, talk about his Nobel Prize, because I think his research, at least as a psychologist, is pretty interesting. So in 2013, Thomas Südhof won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, along with his colleagues Rothman and Sheckman, for their work on something called vesicle trafficking. What the heck does that mean? So basically, imagine these are two different neurons in your body. Between each neuron in your body, there is a little gap. So when this neuron wants to send a message to this neuron, it needs to find a way to send a signal across that little gap. We call that gap a synapse. So when this neuron wants to send a signal to this neuron across the synapse, it uses these little balloons of fat that it has inside its body, which are filled with various different chemicals, which we call neurotransmitters. And so when it needs to send a signal, those balloons of fat fuse with the surface of this neuron, releasing the neurotransmitters, stuff like dopamine or endorphins, which you've probably heard of before, which then tells this neuron to fire. And essentially, Südhof and his colleagues discovered that this process is controlled by calcium and also something which they discovered, which they called snare proteins. And the discovery of these mechanisms come with a lot of different implications for various different psychiatric disorders like depression disorder, anxiety disorder, potentially autism. So that's a bit of background on Südhof's Nobel Prize. And as you can imagine, being a prominent scientist like this, winning a Nobel Prize, comes with a lot of perks. Südhof currently is a professor at Stanford, a place where the average salary for professors is $200,000 a year, and I imagine Südhof is earning a healthy amount more than that, given he's a Nobel Prize winner. And Südhof is also on a bunch of other companies who do work related to his research, including one called Sanofi, which, according to this website, earns him another healthy $150,000 a year. Now, so Südhof is very successful, and I've absolutely no problem with that. I think that scientists who do great work should be paid well and should be successful, because of course we want to incentivize scientists to make cool discoveries and do impactful work. However, what we don't want are scientists cheating in order to have that success. Now, I'm not directly accusing Südhof of cheating here, but as of the time of filming, there are 35 of Südhof's papers that have been flagged on a website called PubPeer, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a website where fellow scientists can critique other scientists' work and point out things that they think need to be addressed. Unsurprisingly, the person who has found the most anomalies in Südhof's work is friend of the channel, Elizabeth Bick. Bick has found multiple instances of duplications of images and just images that don't look right in her opinion. So I'm going to go through a couple of different examples. This first one is a 2012 paper from Südhof and his colleagues. This image seems to be the result of some kind of fluorescence microscopy. It's showing aggregations of a protein called alpha-synuclein, which I believe is a protein that is associated with Parkinson's. I'm not an expert by any means, but I think the way this works is that the clumpier your alpha-synuclein, the more neurons die and the worse your Parkinson's is. So I believe each box in this figure is supposed to represent a different mutation of alpha-synuclein. So each box should be unique and completely different to each other. But as you can see from the two areas highlighted in yellow, these sections of the boxes are identical but rotated 90 degrees. And also the two areas in purple are identical as well, but rotated 180 degrees. So that looks pretty dodgy, right? How did that happen? Are the authors trying to make their results look different to how they actually are? Well, according to the authors of the paper, it was an honest copy and pasting error. Jacqueline Burr, who's the first name author on this paper, said that, yeah, it was some kind of copy and pasting error. Something about the images were on a PowerPoint and they had to crop them and paste them and they cropped the wrong one or something. And then she posted a corrected file. Okay, so that looked pretty dodgy, but the interaction was at least, pretty cordial between Elizabeth Bick and Jacqueline. Nothing too heated going on there. However, when it comes to Südhof himself, his responses to Elizabeth Bick have been less than cordial, shall we say. If we take a look at this latest PubPeer post by Elizabeth Bick, this was just posted a week before the time of filming. This paper came out in 2010 in one of Nature's journals, specifically Nature Structural and Molecular Biology, which is a pretty prestigious journal. And as you can see, there's again examples of image duplication. The rectangles in the same colors are identical, so as you can see, there are 3 orange rectangles, 3 red rectangles, etc., etc. You can see there's lots of duplicated areas within this image. Now, that is something which is concerning in a Western blot image like this, and Südhof's reply was a little defensive. He goes, "Thanks, I'm trying to understand the accusation here that within digitally reproduced images of immunoblot stripes that are clearly not stitched and were reproduced from non-digital data at low resolution contain tiny areas that are unexpectedly similar, i.e. intentionally manipulated, whereas the bands themselves are not manipulated. I'm just trying to figure out what Dr. Bick's AI-powered software mining our old papers may have found. This is such a bizarre accusation. So essentially, Südhof is blaming these visual artifacts on the fact that the image is low resolution, which is complete nonsense in my opinion, and that is also the opinion of another PubPeer poster who said, figure S6b contains rectangular regions that are perfect clones of each other. This cannot have happened by chance, as in much, much less than 10 to the power of 986, and blaming this on a reproduction artifact of a digitized image is as believable as saying the dog ate my homework. In a much cooler tone, Elizabeth Bick also replied to Thomas Südhof's comment by saying, Dr. Südhof, I am not accusing anyone of anything, but I am trying to find a reasonable explanation for these unexpected areas. As I am sure you will know, in Western blots, the bands are not the only type of results. Negative lanes are of equal importance since they show a lack of expression of the protein of interest, as is the case here. If you don't understand what that means, maybe this is the first Pete Judo video that you're watching. The way that Western blots work is that they show bigger blots if that protein is more present in your sample. So the bigger, darker, and thicker the blot, the more present that protein is, and if there's no blot, that means that that protein isn't present in your sample. So Elizabeth Bick is pointing out here that just because the blot itself was not duplicated doesn't mean that this isn't important. The fact that this negative space has these clear duplications indicates that perhaps there was something there before that has now been covered up, or perhaps this image was manufactured artificially and therefore these visual artifacts are being discovered. And then at the end of the comment, Elizabeth Bick kind of drops the mic on Südhof and says, also, I found these regions by eye. And actually it's quite ironic that Südhof is making fun of AI algorithms in this case, because if anyone has used a dodgy AI to produce their work here, it's Südhof's colleagues most likely. This looks like something that might happen as a result of some kind of Western blot image generating AI, or it could just be somebody messing around with Photoshop, either the author themselves or somebody that they paid. Either way, these kind of visual artifacts should never be found in legitimate Western blots, and so this looks really dodgy. And in my opinion, I don't think that Südhof's reply is particularly convincing or that he's handled the situation very well at all. So those are just two examples of the anomalies that are coming out about Südhof's work, and there seems to be a couple of new ones every week recently. Like I said, there are now 35 papers being looked at as having suspicious stuff in them, and actually one of Südhof's papers has already been retracted. This is the paper. It's a 2023 paper that was published in PNAS. That's PNAS, no jokes in the comments please. So the reason why this PNAS paper was retracted is because there's a bunch of fake data in it. Here are some examples of the data that was called out by people on PubPeer. As you can see, the two areas in green show exactly the same numbers, the exact same measurements for two different experimental conditions. The chance of that happening in reality is basically impossible, especially not in exactly the same order. Same here with the numbers in blue, same here with the numbers in cyan and the ones in pink as well. This didn't just happen once in the paper, but happened multiple times. As you can see, there's another set of numbers here. In the experimental condition on the left, these numbers are all grouped together. On the ones on the right, there seems to be a few random numbers. I don't know if the author was trying to throw people off and trying to make it look like they weren't cheating when they obviously were. So there's clearly some dodgy stuff going on here. Why do the numbers look like this? This kind of exact duplication of numbers in the same sequence is impossible. It's clearly being manipulated by somebody. So because this paper looks so dodgy, the raw data was independently analyzed by another scientist at Stanford, a guy called Dr. Daniel Martis, and as a result, the paper has now been retracted from PNAS. Fake data. It's back again. So with one retraction under his belt and over 30 papers now under investigation, it is not looking good for Dr. Südhof. But establishing intent and who in each of these cases actually did the cheating or honest mistaking is a lot harder to establish. In my opinion, it seems highly unlikely that Dr. Südhof himself was the one who was doing any of this stuff. As the final author on the paper and as a scientist of his caliber, he's likely just there in an advisory role meeting with the students and postdocs who are working with him, who actually do all the legwork for each of these papers. But nevertheless, it still doesn't look good to have so many papers with your name on it that have these kind of anomalies coming up. So let me know what you think of this Südhof situation in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.